With Trump ordering Alcatraz to reopen in 2025, attention is turning to the prison's darkest secrets, especially its most inhumane punishment cells.
Warden, after a quarter of a century in the federal prison system, can you tell me what sort of mental process these long-time men use in order to survive, to keep their sanity?
You must project your thoughts into a world of fantasy.
That one line says it all. Inmates were pushed so far, they had to mentally escape just to survive. And it wasn't just the walls. They were stripped naked, starved, and locked in pitch-black isolation for days. What really went on in Alcatraz's most feared cells, and could we see it all happen again? Let's get into it. The torture chambers of D Block. The most horrific cells at Alcatraz were found in D Block, especially an area known as the Hole. According to historical records, D Block contained 36 segregation cells and 6 solitary confinement cells, officially called confinement chambers. The Hole comprised cells numbered 9 through 14 and represented the most extreme punishment available to Alcatraz administrators. What made these cells so inhumane? Prisoners placed in the Hole were confined 24 hours a day, with only 2 brief exceptions: a single 10-minute shower per week, and just 1 hour of exercise during the same period. 5 of these cells were equipped with only the most basic amenities, a sink and toilet. But the worst cell, ominously nicknamed the Oriental, or strip cell, featured only a hole in the floor to serve as a toilet. Prisoners confined to this cell were often stripped naked and left in this condition for up to 2 days. The food situation in these punishment cells was equally dire. Inmates in the Hole received only bread and water twice daily, with a full meal provided only every third day. This was later amended to include soup daily and a full meal every second day. Former inmate Henry Young testified about these conditions, stating that prisoners received no soap, tobacco, or toothbrush, with their diet limited to just 3 slices of bread daily and only 2 full meals during a 13-day period. Young described the smell in these cells as stink, comparing it to stepping into a sewer.
I came here for escaping from other prisons. This was a horrible place. There's no recreation here during the work week.
That brief but telling statement comes from William Bill Baker, also known as Alcatraz the Mouse from 1259, who served time on the island and later wrote a book about his experiences. His first-hand account gives us a glimpse into the harsh realities that prisoners faced. The matter-of-fact way Baker describes the lack of psychological support highlights the callousness of the Alcatraz system. A preacher was the only outlet for prisoners' mental anguish. There were no psychologists, no counselors, and certainly no consideration for mental health. The environmental conditions in these cells were designed to maximize suffering. The cell house was exposed to cold Pacific winds, with old ventilators letting cold air into the dungeon rooms. Guards would sometimes turn on air conditioning at night in the isolation cells and use hoses on prisoners, leaving them wet in their already cold environments. This combination of darkness, cold, and wetness created conditions that went far beyond simple punishment. It was torture by environmental manipulation. One might wonder how long prisoners were subjected to these brutal conditions. Federal law technically limited solitary confinement to a maximum of 19 days, but historical records and inmate testimonies reveal that many prisoners, including dozens reported by former inmate Brian Conway, stayed much longer, sometimes at risk to their lives. Jim Quillen, who served at Alcatraz from 1942 to 1952, provided a vivid first-hand account of his time in solitary confinement. He described the cell as pitch black and soundproofed, with very cold temperatures. Inmates in solitary were given minimal clothing, just shorts, socks, and coveralls. The cell contained only a metal bed frame, toilet, and sink, with lights turned on at 6:30 a.m. and turned off immediately after meals, leaving prisoners in total darkness most of the time. Quillen described the meals as particularly unappetizing, with bread buried in oatmeal and prunes placed on top, no milk or sugar provided, and only coffee to drink. To maintain his sanity, Quillen developed coping mechanisms like tearing a button from his coveralls, flinging it in the darkness, and then searching for it. He would also pace between the toilet and the door. The mental toll of these conditions cannot be overstated. The use of dungeons or the Hole caused hallucinations, extreme sensory disorientation, depression, and suicidal tendencies. After a general strike in 1936, conditions reportedly worsened, with prisoners allegedly receiving no food whatsoever for 2 days. Brian Conway, a former inmate, noted that during his last year at Alcatraz, 14 out of 317 prisoners went violently insane. He attributed this to what he called the exquisite torture of restricted and undeviating routine. Conway also detailed the frightful conditions in solitary confinement, describing describing the constant howling and cursing of inmates and noting incidents of self-mutilation, including one convict who chopped off his fingers. Sleep deprivation was another tool used by Alcatraz guards to break prisoners mentally. Conway reported that guards would conduct target practice outside the cells, deliberately disrupting inmates' sleep patterns and adding to their mental stress. This form of psychological warfare was particularly effective when combined with the other deprivations Alcatraz prisoners endured. The physical abuse that occurred at Alcatraz went beyond just environmental manipulation and isolation. Multiple inmates, including Henry Young and Harmon Whaley, reported being beaten by guards. Frank Heaney, a former guard, mentioned that senior officers used blackjacks, leather-covered clubs filled with lead, to knock prisoners unconscious. These physical assaults added another layer of brutality to the already inhumane conditions. One particularly disturbing form of abuse was force feeding, which was employed against hunger strikers. This practice, described by some as alimentary rape, involved strapping inmates down and using a rubber tube to force a mixture of milk, sugar, and eggs into their stomachs. This was notably used in 1936 when 10 prisoners went on hunger strike, and again in the 1950s when a Catholic priest intervened on behalf of a Puerto Rican prisoner who was fasting for Lent. Another area occasionally used for punishment was the Spanish dungeon below A Block. This area was used in the late 1930s for particularly unmanageable inmates who would be handcuffed to bars for short periods. While less frequently used than D Block, the Spanish dungeon represented another site of extreme punishment within Alcatraz. Alcatraz's philosophy of maximum security, minimum privileges was crystallized in how the prison's administrators treated inmates. This approach was designed to break the spirits of prisoners through deprivation and isolation.
We don't have newspapers at this institution, Ed. We do have a 2-channel radio system. We don't have a commissary where they can supplement their diet in the dining room. We have 2 movies a month.
While Warden Madigan might have presented these restrictions as simple limitations in his 1957 interview with Ed Murrow, the reality was that they formed part of a calculated system designed to control inmates through deprivation. For comparison, let's consider what the standard cells at Alcatraz were like. The typical cell measured approximately 9 feet by 5 feet by 7 feet high. They were furnished with a bed, desk, wash basin, and toilet. Basic amenities, but still significantly more humane than the punishment cells. However, even these regular cells offered no privacy for inmates, creating a constant state of vulnerability and exposure. The combination of physical abuse, psychological torture, and extreme isolation created an environment that tested the limits of human endurance. Many inmates broke under the pressure, while others developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to survive, though rarely without lasting psychological damage.
Is everything under control in there tonight?
Well, I hope so, Mr. Murrow. It looks very quiet and serene. You never know in this institution. It's a tough job. You never can relax on the pressure, and yet you can't worry.
That was Warden Paul J. Madigan in his 1957 television interview, projecting the controlled image that prison officials wanted the public to see. But beyond the carefully managed tours and media appearances, a much darker reality existed within Alcatraz's walls, particularly in the torture chambers of D Block. Even some government officials recognized the problematic nature of Alcatraz's extreme approach to punishment. In 1939, U.S. Attorney General Frank Murphy publicly criticized the penitentiary, stating, "The whole institution is conducive to psychology that builds up a sinister and vicious attitude among prisoners." Murphy even attempted to close down Alcatraz based on these concerns. That a high-ranking government official would make such a statement about a federal institution underscores the severity of the conditions at Alcatraz. Another former prisoner, Roy Gardner, described Alcatraz in his book, Hellcatraz, as a tomb of the living dead, emphasizing the dehumanizing nature of the prison's regime. This vivid metaphor captures the essence of what made Alcatraz so devastating. It didn't just physically confine individuals, it stripped away their humanity and dignity. Broken minds, broken bodies. Let's turn our attention to specific cases that illustrate the brutal reality of the prison's punishment system. Let's begin with the disturbing case of Ed Wuttke. Wuttke was convicted of murder and sentenced to 27 years in prison. In 1937, he became the first prisoner to commit suicide at Alcatraz during its federal era. On November 13th of that year, Wuttke used a blade from a pencil sharpener to fatally slice through his jugular vein. Guards found him dead in a pool of his own blood. This tragic act fact, likely driven by the prison's harsh conditions and the psychological torture of isolation, underscores the devastating mental toll that Alcatraz took on its inmates. But Vutka wasn't the only prisoner driven to self-harm by Alcatraz's brutal regime. Rufe Percival, who had a history of violence, was transferred to Alcatraz in 1935. After being recognized and subjected to abuse by fellow inmates for his past role in shooting escapees at another prison, Percival took extreme measures. In September 1936, he used an axe from a fire truck to cut off 4 of his own fingers, an act of desperation to seek transfer due to the mental strain he was experiencing. Following this shocking act of self-mutilation, Percival's mental health continued to decline precipitously. Reports indicate that he began experiencing severe paranoia, including the belief that an alligator was living in his cell. He also made attempts to hang himself. Percival's deterioration is a stark example of how Alcatraz's conditions could completely shatter an inmate's grip on reality. Another disturbing incident that highlights the inhumane conditions at Alcatraz was the hunger strike of 1936. Trouble began in January of that year in the prison laundry. The situation escalated until 120-130 inmates were locked in their cells, with approximately 100 of them yelling in protest. 5 were immediately sent to solitary confinement. By February 15, 1936, the remaining 15 prisoners went on a hunger strike to protest the conditions, which lasted 3 days. The prison's response to this act of resistance was brutal. The chief physician decided to force-feed the striking inmates. 10 prisoners had tubes forcibly administered to them, with 2 still being force-fed by the end of January. This practice, sometimes called alimentary rape, involved strapping inmates down and using a rubber tube to force a mixture of milk, sugar, and eggs into their stomachs. The violent, invasive nature of force-feeding added another layer of trauma to an already dehumanizing experience. During Quillen's time in solitary, he witnessed a fellow inmate commit suicide by slashing his wrists and elbows, bleeding to death under a blanket, while guards remained unaware. This tragic incident highlights not only the desperation that drove prisoners to take their own lives, but also the negligence of the prison administration when it came to monitoring vulnerable inmates. Henry Young, another inmate who experienced the hole, provided testimony about the conditions during his 1941 trial for murdering fellow prisoner Rufus McCain. Young described the hole as having no basic amenities, with minimal food, 3 slices of bread daily, 2 full meals in 13 days, and a sewer-like smell. He noted that prisoners received no soap, tobacco, or toothbrush. Young's account is particularly significant because it was provided under oath during a legal proceeding, adding an additional layer of credibility to his description. The racial dynamics at Alcatraz added another layer of injustice to an already brutal system. Racial segregation was prevalent within the prison, with African American inmates facing discriminatory practices. Robert Lipscomb, a black inmate from Cleveland, Ohio, arrived at Alcatraz in 1954 and quickly became labeled a racial agitator for organizing against segregation in work assignments and living arrangements. Lipscomb's activism came at a steep personal cost. He faced near constant punishment, including multiple stints in solitary confinement simply for challenging the prison's racist policies. Lipscomb wrote letters to U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and the Bureau of Prisons, highlighting the sentencing disparities he observed. Lipscomb pointed out that he had received a 25-year sentence for distributing 17 counterfeit $20 bills, totaling just $340, while other individuals involved in crimes involving millions of dollars received sentences ranging from probation to just 10 years. This stark disparity suggested a pattern of racial persecution within the justice system. Despite Lipscomb's persistent efforts, Alcatraz was never desegregated during its operation. In fact, desegregation in California prisons didn't occur until after a 2005 U.S. Supreme Court decision, long after Alcatraz had closed its doors as a federal penitentiary. This sobering fact reminds us that the injustices of Alcatraz were part of a larger, systemic problem within America's criminal justice system, one that continues to have repercussions today. Let's take a moment to hear from the other side, the guards who worked at Alcatraz. Their perspective, while different from that of the inmates, provides additional context for understanding the prison's environment. Frank Heaney, who at age 21 was the youngest guard at Alcatraz in 1948, described his experience in an interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He detailed a 40-hour work week that included various duties: conducting counts, performing shakedown detail, checking cells for contraband, and serving as a yard officer. Heaney noted the strict routine for inmates who woke at 6:30 a.m. and were counted every 30 minutes. He He emphasized the limited privileges available to prisoners, such as the absence of newspapers or magazines, and the fact that inmates were only allowed roll-your-own cigarettes and cheap tobacco. Heaney also mentioned the psychological impact of incarceration, noting that inmates often experienced anxiety upon release and were given sleeping pills to help them cope with this transition. This detail suggests an implicit acknowledgement of the psychological damage inflicted by the Alcatraz system, even from the perspective of those who helped enforce it. Despite the official narrative presented by figures like Warden Madigan, who emphasized security and order, the reality of life at Alcatraz was one of constant psychological pressure and the ever-present threat of extreme punishment. The limited privileges, strict routine, and isolation from the outside world created a pressure cooker environment where even minor infractions could result in severe consequences.
Mrs. Madigan, with your daughters and their youngsters away from home, did you ever get lonely on Alcatraz?
Only on holidays, and especially at Christmas.
At Christmas?
Yes.
Warden, is that a particularly trying period inside the penitentiary?
Well, I think that is the most difficult day of the year, Ed.
Even Warden Madigan, the face of authority at Alcatraz, acknowledged the profound human impact of isolation, particularly during holidays like Christmas.
Christmas Eve is a lonesome day for anyone that's away from home, and I've seen men in cells weeping and sobbing, just thinking about being away from their family.
Despite the extreme hardships, inmates found ways to maintain their humanity and even resist the dehumanizing system in small ways. The legacy and lessons of Alcatraz. It's important to examine how this dark chapter in American history continues to resonate today. The legacy of The Rock extends far beyond its closure in 1963, influencing our understanding of incarceration, punishment, and human rights. First, let's consider why Alcatraz ultimately closed. The prison ceased operations on March 24, 1963, primarily due to two factors: prohibitively high operating costs and structural deterioration. Running Alcatraz cost nearly $10 per prisoner per day, compared to just $3 at other federal prisons, a significant difference at the time. Additionally, the constant exposure to salt spray from the bay had caused severe structural deterioration, requiring an estimated $5 million in repairs. The infamous escape attempt of 1962, involving Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, also contributed to the decision to close the facility. This escape, which remains shrouded in mystery to this day, exposed vulnerabilities in what was supposed to be America's most secure prison and further damaged Alcatraz's reputation. After its closure as a federal penitentiary, Alcatraz underwent a transformation. Since 1972, it has been part of the National Park Service, attracting over 1 million visitors annually. The prison that once represented the height of human suffering and isolation has become a tourist attraction, with former cells now seen through the lens of historical curiosity rather than current horror.
I'll be there all day long. I'll be glad to answer your questions, take pictures, sign autographs. I can't help it if history made me a rock star.
As we hear in this clip, former prisoner William Bill Baker found himself in the unexpected position of celebrity, signing autographs and taking pictures with tourists fascinated by his experiences. The irony of this transformation, from dehumanized prisoner to rock star, highlights the complex way in which society has processed Alcatraz's dark history. Baker's reflection on how his relationship with Alcatraz and the public has changed over time speaks to the broader transformation in how we view this infamous prison. What was once a place of active suffering has become a site of historical reflection and tourism. One of the most persistent elements of Alcatraz's legacy is the conspiracy theories that continue to surround the prison, particularly regarding the 1962 escape attempt. This escape, carried out by Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, with Alan West left behind, has been the subject of intense speculation for decades. The inmates used sharpened spoons to chip away at their cell walls, created decoy heads with human hair from the prison barbershop, and escaped through a vent using a raft constructed from 50 raincoats. Officially, the three men are listed as missing and presumed drowned, with the FBI concluding that their odds of survival were negligible due to the cold water temperatures and strong currents of San Francisco Bay. However, the fact that their bodies were never recovered has fueled ongoing speculation about their fate. This theory gained additional traction in 2013 when the San Francisco Police Department received a letter purportedly from John Anglin, which stated, "My name is John Anglin. Anglin, "I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." The letter claimed that Frank Morris had died in 2008 and Clarence Anglin in 2011. The writer, claiming to be 83 years old and suffering from cancer, offered to surrender in exchange for medical treatment. The FBI assessed the letter but found the results inconclusive, and the case remains open with the U.S. Marshals Service. Family members, including Robert Anglin, reportedly claimed to have maintained contact with the escapees until 1987, adding another layer to this enduring mystery. Other myths have also become part of Alcatraz's cultural legacy. For instance, there's the persistent belief that the waters surrounding Alcatraz were infested with man-eating sharks, adding to the prison's inescapable reputation. However, the Bureau of Prisons has clarified that there are no such sharks in San Francisco Bay, only small bottom feeders. The real deterrents to escape were the cold water temperatures and strong currents. Another common myth is that Alcatraz was completely escape-proof. In reality, 36 inmates attempted to escape during the prison's operation. 23 were captured, 6 were shot and killed, 2 drowned, and 5 remain missing and unaccounted for. These statistics challenge the narrative of Alcatraz's impenetrability that prison officials worked hard to cultivate. Perhaps the most surprising twist in Alcatraz's ongoing story came very recently, on May 5, 2025, when President Donald Trump announced his directive to reopen the infamous prison. In his announcement, Trump ordered the Bureau of Prisons, Department of Justice, FBI, and Homeland Security to reopen a substantially enlarged and rebuilt Alcatraz to house America's most ruthless and violent offenders. This directive follows Trump's ongoing clashes with courts over various policies, including proposals to send alleged gang members to foreign prisons, such as facilities in El Salvador. The announcement reflects his law and order agenda, which has included criticism of what he terms radicalized judges for ensuring due process for migrants. Experts in the field have expressed skepticism about the feasibility of this plan. Professor Gabriel Jack Chin argued that refurbishing Alcatraz is not realistic at all, pointing out that the federal prison population is currently down 25% from its peak, with many empty beds already available in the system. Political reactions have been divided, with Nancy Pelosi dismissing the idea as not a serious one, and Scott Wiener describing it as deeply unhinged, an attack on the rule of law. The New York Times has noted the extraordinary expense that would be involved in such a project, particularly in light of planned Justice Department budget cuts. These reactions highlight the complex intersection of politics, criminal justice policy, and historical memory that continues to make Alcatraz a focal point for national debate. It's worth reflecting on how Alcatraz's most inhumane cells compare to modern solitary confinement practices. While today's solitary confinement units generally provide better physical conditions than the whole did, many of the psychological effects remain similar. The extensive use of solitary confinement in American prisons continues to be criticized by human rights organizations for its devastating mental health impacts. The racial dynamics that Robert Lipscomb experienced at Alcatraz also continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about mass incarceration and racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Lipscomb's activism against segregation at Alcatraz, for which he faced severe punishment, was part of a larger struggle for civil rights that continues to this day. The stories of individual prisoners like Ed Wootker, Ruth Percival, and Henry Young remind us that behind the statistics and policies of any prison system are human beings whose capacity for suffering is real and profound. Their experiences, tragic as they were, serve as stark reminders of what can happen when punishment becomes divorced from humanity.
Well, Warden, are you free to proceed, or has the system got you between two gates there?
Well, I think we're free to proceed. We still have another gate before us, Mr. Morrow, but I think we can get out all right.
How do we get that one open?
Pardon, Mr. Morrow?
How do we get that one open?
We've made it.
This brief exchange between Ed Murrow and Warden Madigan perfectly encapsulates the multi-layered security system that made Alcatraz famous. The series of gates and checkpoints that Murrow had to navigate as a visitor were the same ones that made escape so difficult for inmates. But while Murrow could simply walk out after his interview, the prisoners remained trapped, not just physically, but psychologically. Alcatraz was more than just a physical location. It was a symbol of a particular philosophy of punishment, one that prioritized security and isolation over over rehabilitation or human dignity. The darkest corners of Alcatraz, D Block, and the Hole represent the logical extreme of this philosophy, where punishment becomes an end in itself, divorced from any consideration of rehabilitation or human rights. The legacy of Alcatraz's most inhumane cells is not just as a historical curiosity, but as a warning about the capacity for institutional cruelty within any system that holds power over vulnerable individuals. The abuses that occurred at Alcatraz happened largely because they were hidden from public view, with official narratives obscuring the brutal reality experienced by prisoners.
Warden, after a quarter of a century in the federal prison system, can you tell me what sort of mental process these long-time men use in order to survive, to keep their sanity?
Well, in order to do a lot of time, Ed, and keep your stability, I'm sure you must project your thoughts into a world of fantasy. You can't face reality each day without doing some daydreaming and projecting yourself into a different situation.
Even Warden Madigan acknowledged the extreme psychological challenge of long-term incarceration at Alcatraz. His mention of prisoners needing to engage in fantasy and daydreaming to maintain their sanity reveals an implicit recognition of the unbearable nature of the Alcatraz experience. The need to mentally escape an environment that one physically cannot leave speaks volumes about the psychological brutality of the prison system.
What do they dream about, these daydreams?
Oh, perhaps being home or some other place, or doing some particular type of work, or taking part in some pleasure that they wish. Certainly you have to do some dreaming.
This follow-up reveals the basic human desires that prisoners held onto: home, work, simple pleasures, elements of normal life that were systematically denied to them at Alcatraz. The fact that Warden Madigan recognized these mental coping mechanisms suggests that even those who administered the system understood its inherent cruelty. While some visitors to Alcatraz today may view it merely as a fascinating historical site, it's important to remember that the prison represents a cautionary tale about what happens when punishment becomes an end in itself, divorced from considerations of human dignity and rehabilitation. The extreme conditions in D Block and the Hole were not aberrations, but rather the logical conclusion of a philosophy that viewed certain prisoners as beyond redemption and undeserving of basic human rights. Prison's transformation from a site of active suffering to a tourist attraction represents a complex shift in American society's relationship with its own penal history. While over 1 million visitors annually now walk the corridors where prisoners once suffered, it's essential that this history be presented not as mere entertainment, but as an opportunity for critical reflection on our past and present approaches to punishment. The recent proposal to reopen Alcatraz raises troubling questions about whether we've truly learned from this dark chapter in our history. The fact that a major political figure would suggest returning to a symbol of extreme punishment, despite expert opinions that such a move would be impractical and unnecessary, suggests that the lessons of Alcatraz have not been fully absorbed by all segments of American society. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.